Okay. Thank you so much, Christine. And I think the discussion is really getting very interesting. And even as we discuss around this issue of COVID, I know there are different areas that already have been covered. But again, we want to change gears and now have a look at areas around preparedness in handling future pandemic, because COVID was here with us, but in the future, because it's being said that more pandemics are yet to come, but how ready are we? Because I think we've seen issues around how governments have reacted in handling COVID-19, from lockdown to curfews, and also from other challenges that other speakers have mentioned. So I just want us to change gears, and before that, I would want to introduce Dr. Kimani. I think is here with us, Makobo Kimani. So just to introduce him, I'll read his bio here. So Dr. Kimani is a Kenyan trained medical doctor with a master's in public health degree from the University of Nairobi. He was recently awarded a PhD from the University of Amsterdam based on his work that centered around HIV prevention in key population, especially HIV pre-exposure, prophylaxis, PrEP programming. He has since moved into a vaccinology space and leads COVID vaccine trial in coastal Kenya. Dr. Kimani, in addition to his science, he leads public engagement and has a keen interest in translation of research into policy for community benefit. Just to mention that he is also a reviewer of the Cambridge Scientific and Ethical Review Committee. He's a strong proponent of gender equity in STEM, addition to desire and mentoring the next generation of Africa. So Dr. Kimani, if you're here, maybe you can just wave and people can just say a word if you're here.
Yeah, good evening. Depending where you're from, good evening or good afternoon. I'm struggling a little bit with my camera because I'm trying to turn it on, but I'm on my phone, so that might be the challenge. I'll keep struggling with it as we speak, but I hope you can hear me nonetheless. The other thing I'll issue a disclaimer is that it's about 7 p.m. I'm in Kilifi, so I'm actually home, so there might be some background noise. Please bear with that, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum. So yeah, thanks a lot for having me in this meeting. It's a huge pleasure to have been invited for this panel discussion, and looking forward to seeing how I can share my expertise and get ideas from other panelists. So thank you very much. Let me keep struggling with my camera as you introduce the other panelists.
Okay, thank you so much, Daktari. I think I don't know if Dr. Ossi managed to join us, so that I can do the introduction. If you're missing Dr. Ossi, I think my colleague already introduced Professor Andrew earlier on. So I think just to kick us off, I just want us to go deeper into this, and I'll also tackle some of the areas that Christine talked about around public health, these issues around social economic context, and also the leadership strategy, which will also help us to gear forward in terms of handling future pandemic. So just to kick us off, Dr. Kimani, I think we've seen in terms of preparedness that most countries have had, and in terms of public health context. So again, we hear that WHO is saying that, future pandemics are yet to come, and maybe challenges are also yet to be experienced. So I just wanted your opinion, or you can share with us in terms of what will be the public intervention to be adopted to ensure that continent is well prepared based on what we have experienced in the context of public health. But at the same time also, we've also seen the challenges around investment in preparedness and early detection. So what are also your opinion? And also lastly, in terms of sharing of IPs and know-how, because I think we are, in African context, we're still struggling with the whole issue of having our own vaccine, though, because of the IP issues. So I just wanted you to kick us off and share your opinion in this context. on how prepared are we in handling future pandemics in those contexts. Over to you, Dr. Ali.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Duncan. And again, I apologize for my inability to launch camera. Just one of those technology things. So, I think you're right that we are facing challenges from COVID in itself, but I think more importantly is what the future holds. The fact that something that began in a little known city, before 2019, who knew about the city of Wuhan, and something that began in one little town, and we would see things on social media in December 2019, January 2020, and we knew this, it would affect others, but it never come to us. And 3 months later, the world literally shut down. So what that tells us is that these things, to always expect the unexpected, no one ever thought that would happen. So for Africa, in terms of preparedness, I think one of the really key things, and that was spoken about by a previous panelist as in the opening remarks, was Africa needs to reduce its over-reliance on other manufacturers. So we have, over the last 2 or 3 decades, developed a huge dependence on China. No offense, they have done really well to build their industries, but Africa has then lagged behind. In my country, Kenya, we sometimes import things that are ridiculous. We go to the supermarket and you'll find toothpicks, made in China. That's a little bit ridiculous, but it shows you how dependent we are on imports. Now, while that is just business and that's commerce, what we have learned from COVID is that when countries are faced with situations that threaten their existence, then the whole idea of the global village and humanity actually disappears out of the window. So we had huge issues of vaccine nationalism. People were holding back. Some countries like Canada have been said to be holding stocks of vaccine that are close to expiry because they had hoped that they would, as winter comes in, they would then do a 3rd or a 4th booster shot to their population. So what Africa needs to learn from this lesson, and not just the leadership, but even the populace, is we need to be a little bit more prepared to work together as a continent, work together for ourselves. And then that leads to your question about the sort of, quote unquote, the African vaccine. So on the African continent, there are 2 countries that are really prepared for vaccine production. That's South Africa and Senegal. It doesn't, one of the things that sometimes worries me is when I see, so Rwanda wants to build a vaccine production facility. I think Kenya wants to start importing vaccine in bulk and then put it into vials and that kind of thing. So what we are doing is building silos, even within the African continent. So what Africa needs to do is, and this is really difficult because we really hold strongly to boundaries that we don't really understand, but they were left by our colonial leadership, but we really hold on tight to them. And so we are very even nationalistic in ourselves. So we want to produce vaccines, but only for our people, probably for national pride. But that won't hold in the context of future pandemics, because we are sure there will be future pandemics. This was it was a warning shot that things, and as the world becomes more of a global village, things that were only locked in one little corner of, say, a disease that only affects people that are in the Congo forest will now start spreading because people move much more faster. There's much more, the disease has more contagion, so it's much easier to spread it. So my sort of long-winded answer to your question is, we do need to work together as a continent. It doesn't help that we still hold so strongly to boundaries and nations that were left to us that we really quite don't understand. There's really no difference between the people living on the Kenyan side of the Kenyans. We call them Kenyan Somalis and Somalis. It's really the same peoples, but we hold so close to those boundaries. Yeah, and so back to you, panel chair. Thank you.
Okay, Thank you. Thank you so much for an elaborate explanation. And truly, I must agree that we really need to work together, because more and more African continent people are dependent on this type of partnership whereby it is not driven, But again, in this context, just it tells us that we need to ensure that within our countries, then we need to ensure that we are partnering, we're working together. And for me, I think I'll throw in one of the issues around what we call South-South cooperation. This is something that more and more, even as we look forward to dealing with future pandemic, this is something that as African countries really need to think going forward. So I just want to again change the gear a bit and now look at the economic aspect. And Professor, you already alluded to some of the issues earlier on, but now we're looking at in the future, because we've seen a number of areas have been affected, like you mentioned earlier. And some of the measures that were taken by government, we had lockdowns, we had curfew that affected different countries in terms of the economy. And at the same time, also, we've also seen a number of things that have also grown, like e-commerce, for example, digitalization. I know during the pandemic, I think a number of digital platforms came up, and also a number of people have been doing business online since the pandemic during lockdown. So I just want to hear your opinion that given the lesson that you've learned from COVID-19 since February until the outbreak of the new variant right now, what are the economic policy intervention that should be adopted to ensure that the continent sustainable recovery from the impact of COVID-19? So in terms of maybe food chain security, we've seen a number of challenges in that area. We've seen a number of also issues around trade and investment, at the same time also fiscal policy. So what is your opinion in terms of future preparedness in that context? Over to you, Professor.
Okay, sir, Dr. Donka, thank you so much again. Yeah, I think, we've been able to point out so many of these issues, and especially some of those things, some of those policies, some of those aspects of governance that the African continent need to look into. Maybe I can just try to generalize in this perspective. In the area of increasing expenditure, especially in certain critical sectors in Africa, I think that should be taken so much seriously by the governments across Africa. I will be more specific on those sectors. Number one, the health sector, for instance. Okay, and the education sector, for instance. I mean, I think the World Bank stipulates, sorry, not the World Bank, is it UNESCO? Yeah, UNESCO stipulate about how many percent of GDP should be spent on education. It's about 26% or thereabout, I guess. Maybe, I think over 20% thereabout. I mean, the UNESCO recommended that our country should spend as much as that on education. But do we have that in place in Africa? For instance, in Nigeria, I doubt no. Okay, the percentage of expenditure on education in Nigeria should be less than 5%. So maybe even less than 3%. So if you compare that to what UNESCO recommends, we are just not too serious to handle so many things pertaining to the future. So, and the fact is this, I want to believe that if you invest in education and health sector, those two forms of investment, I mean, theoretically and practically, they seems to have higher rate of return on investments compared to, for instance, investment on other infrastructural development. I mean, what you see in most African countries, like Nigeria, for instance, is to see government officials, governors, presidents, I mean, trying to flaunt their achievements in how many number of bridges, they've built. I mean, you can see that even through some of the activities that is being paraded on the media. You will see some of the officials commissioning 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer road, bridges. I mean, these are also good, I mean, for the people. But if you invest on education, you develop the people. There are so many issues you will end up tackling, in the long run. So when people are educated, you are directly tackling illiteracy, which is so high in most parts of Africa. You know, in the previous section, we talk about, for instance, digitalization, for instance. I mean, access to internet, for instance, and some of these access to basic infrastructure. If you invest on people, and it means what you get is that you're going to have trained personnel, you're going to have trained technicians, you're going to have trained people who are competent to handle some of those basic things. I mean, a good example is someone like me, for instance. If my country had very robust education system, I don't think I would think of traveling outside the country to educate myself. I mean, that is the fact. So investment in education through robust expenditure in the education system is very, very important. So in doing that, we address some of those issues I've mentioned. I think one of my colleagues, I think Dr. Morin, was alluding to the fact that across Africa, you have a lot of illiterate people who are not educated, people who doesn't understand what COVID is, and people who are struggling to even understand what is going on around the world. You have them in the rural areas. I remember then when I was pretty young, we do visits my village during the festive period. I mean, like Easter period or Christmas period. And when we do visit, I remember then, because then in my village, I think we don't even have electricity. That is the early 90s. So we don't have electricity. So imagine, so of course now they have access to electricity. So imagine, because there are still hundreds of villages or rural settlements across Africa that don't have access to electricity. So how do you want these people to understand what pandemic is? Who should communicate? How can they understand some of these issues? Then, while I was pretty young, even despite the fact there is no access to some of these facilities, how do government communicate some of these issues? I remember then, very early in the morning, about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning time, we do often, I mean, we have what we call town crier, someone who walk around the streets, around a small village community, and with kind of bell, you know, ring a bell, just to, I mean, create the attention of the people and pass whatever information that needed to be passed from the village head, for instance. So do we still have those? So you can see, we know that some of these disconnection is, you can find it across Africa, but some of these need to be tackled by the government. But in order to even do that in the long run, education sector need to be sustained. I don't know if that is quite applicable also to so many African countries. You will see also the issue of non-payment of worker salary, especially the teachers or the lecturers in the universities. And I think last year during the pandemic, despite the pandemic, the university system in Nigeria was shut for, I think, about 8 months because the lecturers were on strike. So these are issues. So for the health sector, the same thing applicable. So the government should increase, as a matter of fact, significantly expenditure in the health sector. If that is done in the health sector, I bet you we might still need to get a vaccine outside the continent, but the fact is that we will be able, you know, to have those infrastructural development that will be able to cater for the development of the vaccine. I mean, you can see Russia. Has Russia gone to, I mean, get a vaccine from any of these foreign nations? Maybe China, maybe Europe or United States? No, they developed theirs, despite the fact that, I mean, it's not maybe somehow as because of political issue not being recognized by World Health Organization or other foreign nation, but they have their own vaccine, and I want to believe their own vaccine is working for them because they are using it. So, for instance, let South Africa have their vaccine. Let's Ghana, for instance, Kenya have theirs, Nigeria have theirs. Even if those vaccines are not internationally recognized, we have experts within the country that certify those vaccines that are good, then we go ahead to use those vaccines. So the expenditure on health and education really is a serious concern that all African governments should pay attention to. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I think you've alluded to some key issues here around investment in education. More and more, you've been stressed that we need to invest in education, but also the health sector. But even as we talk about these, I think there's the whole issue of politics. You've also just, as you're winding up, you mentioned the whole aspect of politics. And now I want to hear, the opinion of Dr. David here, Dr. Kimani, in terms of the politicization around COVID-19, because we've seen right now with the new variant, there's a lot of travel bans from several countries from Africa. But again, the question here is, will we be able to solve this pandemic by closing our borders? Will we be able to solve this pandemic by the whole issue of people being so nationalistic? But at the same time also, what is the role of African CDC? We have mentioned more and more that we need to have our own vaccine. So in terms of preparedness, Dr. what is your opinion in terms of the politicization of COVID-19 in the areas of a travel ban? But at the same time, what role do you think in the future that the African CDC should play in terms of our preparedness? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Duncan. That's a very good set of questions. So in terms of politics, there's two aspects to it. There's the local politics and there's on a global level. So locally, COVID has been politicized, obviously, and people, with all due respect to African politicians, they never miss an opportunity to take advantage of something. So again, I'll zero in on my home country, Kenya. So for the first couple of months, where no one was quite sure what was going on with COVID, we actually managed to give politicians a total blackout in this country. And, they were not on the news and it was all just COVID and worries of that. And I think that scared them a little bit in terms of how they become relevant. And so what they have then done is they have run with this narrative. And so they now politicize COVID in itself so that it can be used for expediency. So there are some politicians who use it if you do not want people to congregate, then you can, if you have the powers, you can block people from congregating. If you have the powers, you can congregate yourself and refuse others. So on a local level, we have, that's a politicization of COVID. And it does have its demerits, because when we do that and the populace see that, we can crowd around a politician's vehicle and there are no issues. So really this mitigation measures that we are being forced to stay at home and all that really don't apply. So it did have a negative impact on people adhering to the mitigation measures. And I think that's where our whole containment measures started to fall apart as a country. And by the end of last year, people had gone back to their default settings. So politics in that sense did play a role in making the pandemic a little worse. And we had our third wave in January, February, and we can attribute it to the politics that was done then. As a country, we are heading into an election in 2022, and that worries us a little bit as healthcare providers, because then the tempo will just go up. There'll be more meetings, there'll be more people grouping together, there'll be less attention given to matters that are really important. So that politics locally does have an impact on COVID and can worsen things. And so we are watching things very, very carefully and a little bit worried. On a more global scale, which is what you have alluded to, is just how it's almost being used to, it's almost, I sometimes worry that the world was waiting with bated breath for the opportunity to blame Africa for something, and here it has presented itself. There were unfortunate remarks that came from scientists in Europe in the early parts of the pandemic, where they wanted, they would wonder, why isn't Africa getting it's carrying its fair share of mortality, which was a horrible thing for people to think about. So this recent variant has been politicized, which is, I saw an article this morning that, someone was saying good science should not be penalized, but that's what has been done to South Africa. They did really good science, they did good surveillance, and then they reported their findings, but instead of that being used as a good example, it's actually being used against them. It gets a little worse when the politics then comes from us within. So I have seen, I think some of the countries in Northern Africa have actually issued travel advisories or even travel bans to citizens from the southern part of the continent, which is a little bit ridiculous because our borders are very porous. So while the airports, you could do that, people do walk in and out. So in terms of politics, on the whole, it does have a negative impact on trying to prepare us for future pandemics, because the people then have memory of if COVID, with all that was said about it, it didn't seem to affect the African continent that badly. So this new disease you're telling us about, it's going to be just another similar thing, or people think it's a scam. So what is your next question was, what is the role of the African CDC? I think the first thing the African CDC needs to do is stamp its authority a little bit more. Currently, the African CDC is not very vocal on a lot of things, and I suppose it's when you're led by scientists like myself, our training is to be very quiet and let your results trumpet, but that doesn't, in the policy arena, that probably doesn't work very well. And so the African CDC does need to have people who trumpet it's the good things it does, people who say what should be done, people who can push for more funding from member states, people who can push for it to have a bit more teeth in its mandate when it says this should be done, a way to make governments actually adhere to that. We've got this famous Abuja Declaration from the 1970s, where countries in Africa said they'll invest, I think, 20% of their GDP into health. And I don't think any country about 40 years since that since that declaration has actually achieved that. And so the African CDC does need to find a way to have some teeth so that it not only just issues declarations or ambitious policy statements, but a way to enforce them. And then finally, as you know, the whole the larger African continent, and I'll not get tired of saying this, does need to come together. We at some point lost the whole issue of Pan-Africanism and became very nationalistic. If you look even closer to home, there's very big differences in policies, in politics, in ideology between Kenya and Tanzania, yet the people are so similar. And so that then it makes it very difficult for anything to be done collectively. And so one of the things that now the populace needs to do is look at politicians a little bit, with a little bit of suspicion, to stop looking at them too much as the solution providers, and probably look at them in all honesty as part of the problem, and what can we do as to help ourselves. And that's a very old narrative that used to be said, how can you help yourself? But really, if you think about it, one of the things COVID has taught us is that sometimes we're really on our own and we must see how to help ourselves. So yeah, thanks, Duncan.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you've, as you close, you've mentioned very, very critical issues around unity within Africa. People really need to unite, and that unity, I think, we have not seen it even within our region, because even as Kenya was really struggling to ensure that proper measures were taken, our neighbor, for example, in Tanzania, there was all this misinformation around COVID, and at the same time, we also experienced a number of the whole issue around the shrinking civic space, whereby from journalists, I think a number of journalists were arrested when they were reporting around COVID. So we've also seen this in a number of African countries, the whole issue of human rights violation. And COVID-19 has been used as a tool to violate human rights. And I also wanted to hear from you, Professor, and also this, I also want to hear the opinion of Dr. Kimani on this particular issue of shrinking civic space and human rights violation. And we've seen these, and what lessons can we really learn as we go forward? That people's rights were violated, through curfew, the police brutality. We've witnessed that in Kenya. The number of journalists who are arrested even in our country, in our neighboring country, Tanzania. So, and in other African countries whereby COVID has been used. And like Daktari, you mentioned that even as we go towards the election in Kenya, these might be used as a tool to curtail people's human rights. So what is your thought on this? Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Donka. And this is a very important question and issue that is really very hot in so many of our African countries. And for the audience, I think generally this should be to the general knowledge of everyone that Twitter, for instance, was banned in Nigeria for almost maybe several months now. And there are so many dimensions to that, you see. But the last speaker, what is his name? Dr. McQueen, right? So he mentioned one of those issues relating to domestic issue as well. One of the things that Africa needs to do more is to try to address some of these internal issues, domestic issues, which somehow are really enriched or entrenched in politics, and depending on the country again, maybe religion, okay? And because, there are a lot of issues in most of our countries that normally should be an ordinary issue. But most time the politicians take advantages of most of these issues and try to politicize. So when those issues are politicized, it becomes so complicated, and it divides the country, divides the people. And when religion is brought in again, or some other dimensions are brought in again, that's further fractionalize the country. So on one hand, the internal issues in our countries should actually be addressed. And how do we address those? So because these are our problems. So how do we address our problems? So how to address our problems, I guess this is one of the ways we are trying to address the problems, from the young people perspective. So because we are young people, and we're discussing about these issues. So definitely, I think we have the interest of Africans at heart, and that is why if the young people will continue to discuss some of these issues and try to point out some of those solutions that needs to be applied, I want to believe that is one of the ways we can address some of those internal issues. And we, the Africans, should see some of these internal issues as our own issue, rather than pointing out to sometimes foreign nations. Sometimes ago, I had a discussion with some of my friends that live outside the country as well. And I guess one of them was trying to point out those those challenges that Nigeria, for instance, or African countries, for instance, are facing, and try to point accusing figure of some of those colonial Westerners. It is true that some of those problems that we are having right away in Africa, we can actually link some of these problems to those Western countries. But if we need to look at those issues and look at ourselves and tell ourselves the truth, the fact is, okay, we were once colonized, we were once taken as slave trade, battered or whatever, but now we need to confront those issues by ourselves and solve them. Most of the countries across the globe were also once colonized. For instance, United States, for instance. United States also was colonized, but they, at the time, they decided to solve their own problem. So we need to look inward. Each countries in Africa need to look inward and try to address some specific issues that tends to divide them. Like Nigeria, for instance, for the past few years now, the major issue across that country has been not only corruption, I mean, not even corruption, I would say lack of security. Okay, so, and if we say security, we are not talking about foreign nation try to ridicule our sovereignty. No, we are talking about some of those insecurity dimensions within a country that were perpetrated by Nigerians themselves. Okay, so, but that need to be solved. That need to be addressed. So that is key. So it is very key. If we don't address that, it might be very difficult to address some of those issues that are related to shrinking civic space. Because, for instance, we have, in most of those countries have political parties, for instance, and there are members of those political parties who want to believe that whatever decision the government is taking or whatever policies that address maybe the media, for instance, they want to believe that such decisions or policies are biased. Okay, so the opposition will refute it. But if we confront some of those issues, I mean, if we are able to unite within the country, and it will be very difficult for the government, for instance, to bring about some of those issues like media ban of Twitter and thereabout. If you ask most people in Nigeria, most Nigerians, they will say across the street, there are millions of them who actually say, okay, what the government has done is bad, but also there are millions of Nigerians who are also in agreement with the government. Why? Because of their political affiliation. So those are the issues. So, and that need to be addressed. And you could see across Africa that we virtually don't have a stable political system. I mean, really. So, and if we have a stable political system, then we could have an organization like African Union that's more like speaks for Africa. So when there is, for instance, in Sudan, for instance, the military overthrew the government, for instance, in Burkina Faso, I think, for instance. So in Mali, for instance, also, the African Union could not come to rescue. Do you know why? The reason is because who are the leaders? Who are the key, who are the main individuals or the presidents of the African Union? These are the same people who are also battling those internal crises. 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago, we had the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And really, I was shocked. I was really impressed. I started following him on Twitter, okay? But just within less than 2 years, you can see what is going on in Ethiopia right now, okay? The country is almost gone. So I hope it doesn't go the way of Libya. So those are the issues. So I believe that we need to confront some of those internal crises so that, I mean, you cannot have a perfect country where everyone thinks the same way. I mean, you cannot have a perfect country where every citizen of that country belong to the same political party. No, I mean, but there should be kind of a high level of responsibility from all citizens. I mean, you have, for instance, in the United States, we saw what happened during the last democratic election, because it was almost as if United States was going down. That is to say that, you know, the democracy itself is very delicate. I mean, system of government is very delicate. So the internal issue is very key. So in addressing that, there is need for Africans to look inward and try to resolve some of those issues that confront us within. Then in that way, we might be able to have, when some decisions are being taken by government, such decision might be able to pass because it's being approved by the majority of its citizens. So that is very important.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Thank you so much for I think just to also hear from Dr. Kimani, your opinion on the same question, the whole issue around the shrinking civic space and human rights violation during COVID, and also as we look forward, as we look ahead. I mean, what some of the lessons that you can learn? Over to you, Dr.
Yeah, thanks again, Duncan. Yeah, so Prof has spoken to a lot of the issue, the points I would like to raise. The truth is that, like I said in my previous comments, politicians never miss an opportunity to take advantage of an opportunity. Yeah. So in a lot of countries, COVID was used to deal with other issues. So, for example, in our neighboring country, Uganda, things are still closed. They still enforce an almost total lockdown, which in the bigger scheme of things does not make sense because they still trade with Kenya, they still road transport, but their citizens are sort of held within, there are things that can't happen, schools are still closed. Now, politicians will use anything, and that, COVID was a perfect excuse to put people in their place and to shrink space. And, you can take advantage, there are countries that did imprison at problematic, quote unquote, problematic journalists because you take advantage of COVID, but it's actually a different situation that you're dealing with them about. How to deal with that is probably we need to, and that's where civil society in Africa now needs to be a bit more strict and push for more civil education. People need to learn what are their rights. People need to be able to question. I think the reason why probably Prof was saying Twitter was banned in Nigeria is because Twitter gives people a voice to say things that they probably wouldn't be able to say. So, we in this country, in Kenya, Twitter has been used to change quite a number of things. And at some point, it became so powerful, quote unquote, that none less than the head of state actually deleted his Twitter account because people were using it, well, partly to insult him, but also to ask him really difficult questions about how the governance of the country. So people are learning what their spaces are and what their rights are, but civil society needs to now take the advantage of that and, just kind of push for more teaching of civil liberties and training people on their rights. In terms of what can be, there has to be more noise made about issues like police brutality. I think the problem with and I think Prof spoke about that is, unfortunately, sometimes we do not have very clear stands even as individuals. We do not have a clear picture of what's right or wrong. It depends on who's doing it. So police brutality should be bad, whoever does it. But sometimes if police brutality is being pointed or it's being done to people who are against your political view, you are a little apathetic about it. It doesn't, you almost want to find a way to justify the brutality, forgetting that the same police will then turn themselves on you. So I like what happened last year in Lagos, where the young people just stood up and said no more. There was the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, abbreviated SARS, and the people just said no more, this can't continue. So, and because of that, there was a change. It's not as good as would have hoped, but at least there was a change in terms of that squad was actually disbanded. So what we need is to have some sort of moral compass as people. If something is wrong, it should be wrong. It doesn't matter who's doing it, whether it is because it is your favorite politician, and comes, goes full circle to what Prof was saying about we don't really have political parties. What we have are political vehicles. So what was a horrible union last election now becomes, the people who say that marriage was horrible now pick up the same partners and now form their own alliance because it's just vehicles to power. So we need to have some sort of party discipline, and that's a very difficult thing to do, where you must have a stand. So when people then have a stand, it's easier to call out people when they seem to be changing track and supporting things like shrinking civil spaces or not calling out police brutality. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a role for civil society, but there's also a role for we as individual citizens to ask ourselves very difficult questions, to have difficult conversations about what is our opinion of what is right and wrong. Is it because it's morally wrong, or is it because of who's doing it? Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think it's quite clear that more need to be done in terms of addressing some of these issues. There's some lessons that we've learned, and even as we go forward, we really need to also try and look at some of our policies around the issues around human rights, and even as we conclude, I just wanted maybe Prof and Daktari, your 1 cent opinion or a word in terms of what is your message to African leaders? This is the last question that I want you to just share, maybe in 2 minutes. What is your, in the context of all this that we've discussed today, and as we say that as young people, we really need to stand up and we really need to ensure that our leaders are accountable. So what is your one message that you can address to our African leaders? So Prof, you'll go, and then Daktari will also conclude.
Okay. You know, you know, I don't really have I don't really have let me say good impression about African political elite, and so because of that, I really want to say that for all our political elites or head of government in Africa, because for me, I don't really call them leaders. So I would just say that for our political heads, they should try to be leaders. Okay, because leader will care, you know, leader will listen, leader will be polite when there is need for them to talk or to address issues. Leaders will not just take action, for instance, they try to communicate, try to make a lot of inquiries, deliberate on issues, try to have community meetings, I mean, before making serious statements or political decisions or national decisions. So our political heads should try to be leaders indeed. I mean, for my generation, I'm just about 40 years of age or thereabout. So I grew up, I think I was in high school. Sorry, I'm talking so much again. So I think I was in high school when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and we all celebrated across Africa. So someone like Nelson Mandela, you know, I didn't know much about him, but I think he was a president for a very short time. And from what we read and what he stand for, why he was president in a short time, you could see that is a true leader. So Africans, head of governments need to be true leader. Thank you.
Daktari, what is your message now? Is a new term to our African political heads now that they are leaders. So what is your message to them? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think what I would say to them is the future of Africa is, you know, the population is very young. And so a lot of the people who are young today will still be around 10, 15, 20 years from today. And so history will judge this current crop of leadership very harshly. We will speak, you know, they'll be spoken of in very derogatory terms as a people who, in the same way we speak very derogatory terms of the colonial government. So current leaders should be careful that we do not speak of them and future generations do not think of them in that way. They need to think a bit more broadly as the world becomes a global village. It will be very difficult to hide. So some of the dictators from the 1970s and 80s in Africa were able to go and hide in Europe and live their lives relatively quiet. That's not going to be possible in future. You know, everyone will see you in the streets. There are pictures of you. So people were able to hide because they were not known outside their countries. So now you can't. So there'll be nowhere to hide, or even for your children to hide. So I think for current leadership is you'll be judged very harshly by history. You'll have really nowhere to hide, and you'll probably be used as the example of what went wrong. Kind of how we speak about Nazi Germany. Nothing good is ever spoken of them. So I think current African leaders need to be careful not to be the ones for whom nothing good will ever be said about them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it has been very, very interactive and an interesting session. But even as we conclude, I think one thing is very clear, that unity is very important. And I want to end my session with telling you a very small story. So there was, in a farm, we had, there was a rat, and then there was a chicken, and there was a cow in this farm. So at one point, the farm was invested. Now the rats started to destroy the property within the farm. And so the farmer did set a trap. So that particular night, unfortunately, the trap did not nab the rat, but unfortunately, it nabbed a snake, a very big snake. So in the morning, when the farmer's wife was going to clean the house, unfortunately, the snake was still alive. So she was bitten by this snake. But that particular night, all of them saw the trap, both the rat, the cow, and the chicken. But the cow said, "This trap is not for me. I think it's for you, rat." The chicken said, "This trap is not set for me. It's also set for you." But unfortunately, after the farmer's wife was bitten by the snake, normally what happens once bitten by a snake in this particular context, the medicine was a chicken soup. So what happened, so they did slaughter the chicken, and then they made a chicken soup for the farmer's wife. But unfortunately, the farmer's wife did not make it, so she died. And what happened in most funerals, they had to slaughter the cow. So at the end of the day, both of them ended, but the rat still remained. So my message is, I think unity is very key. So if all of them had decided and found a way of escaping this, because they were seeing it is your problem, is not mine. So that is my key message, and that is what we've really had from our panelists, that we need to unite as Africans. Over to you, and I'm passing this to Nelson. Nelson, thank you.
Thank you, Chendo, and Christine, our moderators for the two sessions, and thank you to Dr. Andrew, Dr. Makobu, Maureen, and Gloria, please, in the first session. That it was also very informative. And thank you for Chendo for that last story, because it really shows us it's like a cap on what we have been. We want the African continent to look like. And it shows us that unity is key. If without unity, there is nothing that can go ahead. So my task is a simple one. I'm supposed to give closing remarks. And first of all, I want to thank you all for making it this far. It's been 2 hours now. And from whatever we have had, it's really interesting. And for example, in the first session, we had that we were looking at the effects that the pandemic has had on Africa, and the second session was looking at how we can react to it and strategically place Africa in a way that we can move forward and actually, despite the presence of this pandemic, gain and do things that work for us as Africans who live on the continent. For example, the first thing we saw is that if we have a supply chain strategy, we had that South Africa has had now rights to produce vaccine, was it from J&J? Also, as Makobu would tell you, in Kilifi, we had, I've been reading the news, we have the first African company that got a $150 worth tender to produce syringes. So we no longer have to wait for syringes to come from India or China. We are making them here in Kilifi, and I think you can see that wherever sometimes the lessons have impacts, this impact of COVID has had, we have learned a lot from it. And if we are organized very well, there is a way we can strategically place ourselves to actually be self-reliant. We also saw something about sensitization and mindset change, which feeds into also investment in education. The more Africans are knowledgeable about rights, about science, about the need to innovate, the more we will be capable of having solutions that work for us. So if government was to invest in education systems, in health infrastructure, I think we would have a better chance of handling or containing pandemics. I really don't hope there is another one, but we would be at a better chance of containing anything similar to COVID that comes our way. Then also relating to this, we also have heard that we should have a moral compass. And the way we can also send this throughout there is through education. The more we have values instilled in our children, youth, or populace, the more we are able to make a stand. And if something is wrong, it's wrong regardless of whether it's done by people you agree with, whether it's done by people whose idea you align with. If you have values instilled in you, a wrong thing is a wrong thing. And then the other thing, the other important point we talked about that I want to talk about quickly is the trust in government, shrinking civic space. Remember, we had something about vaccine hesitancy, but if you look at it from the African perspective, governments have used this, like the panelists pointed out, have used this period, the COVID period, to really suppress dissent. So vaccine hesitancy kind of taps into that, because yesterday you're shooting me off the street because you don't want me to demand for certain rights that are entitled to me as a citizen. Then today you're telling me, actually, as you are healing your wounds, here is a vaccine that you can get from hospitals to save your life. So really, if you look at it from the populace, that disconnect between what they see in their daily lives and what the government is telling them will work for them, as long as that connection is not there, still we can't have anything moving forward. So investing in building public trust is very important in fighting any pandemic that is to come. And once you have public trust, then you see it's easy to have innovations that work at the continent. It is easy to have structures or a populace that is interested in the things that take place in the country. And that way, with education, unity, it's very easy to fight any future pandemics we have. The last, I think, is advocacy. It's using our platforms to really tell these leaders that, hey, it's the things about demagogues, like riding on our feelings to pitch us against each other so that you can get political office. Those days are over. So we need leaders, not rulers, people who really work for us, who listen to the things that we want and do them so that they can meet our demands. And with that, I think then we had the wonderful cow, chicken, snake story from Chando, which I won't repeat, but I want to thank you all for making this possible. Also, I think the Secretariat will have to share our LinkedIn pages, both for the APPN, and if members can, please, I encourage you to follow each other on LinkedIn, Twitter, so that there are very many discussions that we can continue having. And I am sure the more we are connected, the more sessions like this will become more and more easier to handle and also more informative. So thank you very much. I don't know whether I introduced myself. My name is Nelson Wainaina. I currently work in Uganda in the Ministry of Lands. And like Dr. Makobu pointed out, we're still having a lockdown. Actually, I think I will have to move out with my ID because it's already past curfew time and I really have to get home. So thank you very much. And I hope to see you again in another event like this, because there are very many that have been planned. Thank you very much and bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.